So, hi everyone, it's great to have you here and a really warm welcome to this Actuate Global session on improving leadership decision making. Well, actually, let me introduce myself first, I'll get that out of the way. So, as you can see from the name tag, my name is Joanna Thornton, you can call me Jo. I'm a career and leadership coach, consultant and facilitator, and I'm part of Actuate Global's training team. So, it's great to be here today. I think let's move on to have a little think about, or let me let you know what we're actually going to be covering today, so you're clear what we've got in store for you. So our objectives for the session today is to apply decision-making frameworks, to recognise and reduce cognitive bias, to be able to improve ability to navigate ambiguity and trade-offs under pressure, which, you know, pressure is everywhere, isn't it? And to be able to balance logic, intuition, and evidence, and to build decision accountability across teams. So this is what we are aiming for you to leave with today, to having learnt about these things. And so before we really get into it, I'd love to know a little bit more about the people in the room today. So just to get a bit of a sense of some of that experience in the room. So if I could ask you just to pop into the chat your name, your location, your LinkedIn profile, if you've got it to hand, and also what comes up for you if I ask you these questions. So what does great judgment look like in your role? And what makes decisions hard in your environment? So I'll just wait for you to pop a few thoughts into the chat. It'd be really great just to know a bit more about that from you. I can see everyone's concentrating faces trying to find their LinkedIn profiles now. Anyone like to share? So what does great judgment look like? Oh, hello, Chris. Brilliant. So I can see a few different things coming up. Lots of different job titles. Got sales and marketing. Got chief corporate officer. So Stephen, the difference between a successful and unsuccessful resolution to an emergency incident. Robert, question 1. What does great judgment look like? Win-win. Love that. And what makes decisions hard in your environment? Short versus long term. Speed versus everyone bought in. Yes, I recognise that so much. And that is something that will actually come up quite a bit in the content today. And then Stephen, red tape and governance. Yes, I hear you there too. Let's see. So Paul, great judgment is seeing the big picture. And consequences make the decisions hard. Yes, there's lots of great, really interesting things coming up there, and I've already spotted a few themes that might actually crop up naturally in some of the content that we cover. So actually, although everyone's context is very context specific, there will be lots of commonality, I'm sure, between all of us. Okay. So let's dive in and make a start with the first part of the day today, which is about decision making and decision making frameworks in particular. So the thing is, no matter what context they're operating in, leaders today make decisions in really high pressure, ambiguous environments. So you'll be familiar with the term VUCA, I'm sure, which is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. That is the leadership reality pretty much everywhere these days. And so that makes decision making really challenging sometimes and incredibly high stakes very often. So the benefit of using frameworks is they can create some structure. So amongst all of that overwhelm and all of that complexity, the structure actually helps to reduce overwhelm and can increase confidence in the decision making. And we're going to look at three particular frameworks in particular. And in a moment, I'll come on to explain each of them in more detail. And when I do that, you'll see that there are slides mapping each of them out. And if I can invite you to take a screenshot of each of those or a photo of each of those slides, it will help you in the breakout rooms later. But the first framework is the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, and act. And then we've got the Cynefin framework, which is simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic. And then we've got the PACE model, which is problem, alternatives, consequences, execution. So before I explain all of these, I'm just curious if anyone already is aware of these or has used them before. Can you pop a hand up if you're familiar with any of these? Just having a little look. Looks like this is brand new, which is great. Okay. Oh, David, which one or ones have you worked with, David?
I flirted with three of them, but I think I have flirted rather than gone into any great depth.
Fantastic. Well, so you've got a bit of awareness already, and it'll be really interesting to sort of hear where you are maybe at the end once we've been through the material in a bit more detail. But let me just talk you through each of them in turn. And just a reminder to take a photo, take a screenshot or a photo of each one, because you're going to need this info in a minute. So this first slide introduces the OODA loop. And that's a really simple but powerful way that leaders can make decisions in fast-moving environments. And as I said, OODA stands for observe, orient, decide, and act. So just move you out of the way of my slide so I can actually see it. If we start with observe, which is in the top right-hand corner, this is where we look at what's happening right now. What's the current situation? We're gathering facts and signals and data, making sure that we're not making assumptions and we're actually going to be grounded in reality. So getting really clear on what is the reason you want to change, how badly you want to change, what is the current situation you're in. And then we move down to orient. I find this to be the most important, and actually quite often it can be the most overlooked step. This is where you interpret what you're actually seeing. You bring in all your experience and your knowledge and your context to make some sense of the situation. So, where are you at currently relative to where you want to go to? How far is it to your destination? What did your experience tell you? And the interesting thing I think about Orient is that two leaders faced with observing the very same thing actually might orient slightly differently based on actually what their knowledge and experience is. So it's fascinating, but it's a really important part of the process. Once you've done that, you then move over to the left side and you get to decide. And this is based on your understanding. You now choose a path forward. It doesn't have to be the perfect plan. It's just a direction that's good enough for now, based on what you know. You think about the challenges and the setbacks, and then you prepare to do the next bit, which is act. This is where you actually execute. You move forward. You test your decision in the real world, essentially. And so it doesn't need to be a perfect decision necessarily, but all of this loop kind of reinforces itself. You start to make some momentum and move forward kind of based on what you've observed and how you've interpreted it. And success comes from moving through this loop quickly and adjusting as you go. So that is the OODA loop, the first framework. Any comments or questions on that before I move on to the next one?
Yo, it's Steve Taylor. Hi.
Hi, Steve.
I just popped a comment on this in. I think you're going to move on to the Cynefin framework in a
Yes.
second, but I
Yes.
think all I would say is the challenge to me, the main challenge with this OODA loop is if you don't understand the system context in which you're operating, which the Cynefin framework can help you understand, then your actions can be inappropriate to the system. And I think I'm sure you'll come on to that in a second, but I think it's important that just using this framework willy-nilly can actually be dangerous.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really great point. And I guess the purpose of introducing these frameworks is really to get to a point where people are applying some rational decision making to the decisions that they're making. And it's not necessarily about getting to a perfect decision, but it is making sure we don't just leap to action too quickly.
Yeah.
But yes, I'm about to come on to the Cynefin framework next. Yes, Andy.
Yeah, just to follow from, I think the time spent in understanding, I think, is so crucial. You know, it's very easy to not really grab the real context behind something. And I think that, you know, and then anything that's based on that, similar to what Steve's just said, is that you're going to, if you don't understand it, you may create problems if you don't really understand the situation you're starting off with.
Yeah, I completely agree. Thank you. Well, let's move on to the next one then, which is the Cynefin framework. I learned something new, which is that I believe this is the Welsh word for habitat. I didn't know that before. I think I'm correct in saying that. I hope I am.
So I'm part of the Cynefin community with Dave Snowden and crew. So you're close. There's about 5 different words for it, but I think you're fairly close, Joanna.
Am I close enough? I'm in the ballpark, which is good to know. Fantastic. Oh, okay. So we've got an expert in the room, people. So yeah, we're really interested in your thoughts on this too. So this is the next framework I want to introduce, which helps leaders to make decisions, helps leaders decide how to make decisions depending on the situation they're in. So we start from the bottom right, which is clear or simple. This is where things are predictable. And cause and effect are pretty obvious. This is where essentially there's generally a right answer, and we can rely on best practice. And the approach here is sense, which is where you're making meaning from signals so you can understand what to do next, categorize and respond. So we're sort of in kind of just standard operating procedure type territory here. But then we move up to complicated. And here is the area where cause and effect still exist, but they're not really obvious. And expertise is required here because there might be multiple right answers. And that's where good practice applies. And the approach here is sense, analyze, and respond. Next, we move over to the left and we get into the complex domain. This is where things are pretty unpredictable. And you can't always work things out up front because the patterns might only become clear in hindsight. You know, hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? So this is emergent practice. You experiment, essentially. The approach is probe, sense, respond. So you try small, safe to fail experiments first, and then you would learn from those. And then finally, there's chaotic. This is where there's not really a clear relationship between cause and effect. This is where things feel really unstable, probably thinking about crisis leadership type situations here. And in this case, you tend to act first to re-establish order. Yeah, so it's novel practice. It might be used in more of a crisis situation. Okay, has everyone taken a photo of that one before I move on? Just pause for a sec. And then finally, let's move on to the PACE model. Now, this is quite a simple decision-making structure. I quite like this. It can be really effective in certain scenarios. So PACE stands for problem, alternatives, consequences, and execution. It's a really helpful way of making sure that we don't jump too quickly to the solutions and that we stay disciplined about how we decide and how we deliver. So we start with problem. it sounds kind of obvious, identify the issue to be addressed. But actually, sometimes we get that wrong. We don't always totally recognise what the genuine underlying issue is. If we get the problem wrong, if we're not actually trying to sort out the genuine problem, everything else after this is a wasted effort. So that's step one, really pretty critical one. And then the next bit is alternatives. So this is where we generate possible options. We deliberately need to explore multiple ways forward at this point. It can be quite tempting to settle on like the first bright idea or the second bright idea, but actually good decision making does require several viable options, even if like lots of them are later discarded. It's generating those ideas and different alternatives. And then we get to the consequences bit. We evaluate the potential outcomes. So we assess the potential impact, things like benefits, risks, costs. And this is where judgment matters. Not just what might work, but what happens next if we do this, or what could the consequences be? And then finally, execution. And this is where we implement the chosen decision, and we need to do that with clarity. Who is responsible and accountable for what? How can we make this actually work in practice? And without execution discipline, even the best decision doesn't, it may not fly. Any comments or questions on that one? Anything else anyone wants to say before we move on to our first breakout exercise? All good? Got a photo of the PACE model too? Okay, so let me talk you through this activity. So in a moment, my colleague Nicole is going to be popping you into some breakout rooms. But the activity is a major supplier has unexpectedly collapsed, putting a key product line at risk. You must decide whether to pivot to an expensive emergency supplier, pause production, or redesign the offering. And in your small groups, you're going to be applying one of the frameworks that we've been through. You'll make a decision, you'll prepare a 1-minute maximum justification, and then we're going to return and have a debrief. Here we go. Welcome back, everyone.
Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you, Joanna.
So let's have a bit of a debrief then on what you discussed. Give me a thumbs up first of all if you in your group use the OODA framework. I'm just going to get a bit of a sense of how many. Does anyone use that one?
No.
David, can see you. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay, so anyone that wants to chime in who used the OODA framework in their group, I'm interested to know what the framework illuminated for you. Anyone got any thoughts on that from the OODA crew?
We're all being very polite and holding back.
Don't hold back, go for it.
Can I just put something on the table? I thought we had a really enjoyable and productive discussion. So thanks, this 4 of us in there. So the thing that struck me and which came out in our discussion a lot was how many assumptions we're having to make, but also the beauty of OODA being quite an opportunity to iterate and experiment quite quickly. So we were thinking we wouldn't in reality always be making the same assumptions. But yeah, the questions you've got here are spot on, aren't they? Which is we're making loads of assumptions, number one. We're having to talk about all sorts of things, particularly, for example, the impact on the customer. So the product that's currently selling, yes, it might have sold really well historically, but in reality, is there an opportunity here to engineer features out or internals that people know nothing about? And against that, Ian made a great point about the cash flow implications. So from my personal perspective on here, I think we were talking about a combination of depending on what we know or what we assume about the value that people are actually pulling from this product, do we therefore maybe go to the expensive supplier first? And in the meantime, depending, so the examples given of, are we selling to Harrods? What's at stake on their reputation? So therefore, how much time do we have? How much time can we buy, cash flow wise and reputation wise, to then explore taking the opportunity to redesign?
Thank you. Thanks, David. So it sounds like you had a really good discussion in your group. And I'm interested that you immediately, noticed that you were making lots of assumptions. What do you think it was particularly good at kind of bringing to life, like to illuminating, to get it? How effective was it there?
David, Ian, or Evan, do you want to comment, please? Or
I'm not really sure how to say on that. The thing that the thing we picked up on Uda was that it's a nice iterative kind of way of looking at something, and that it's every time you make a decision, you're able to just refine it a little bit more, and then slightly improve. That's what we liked about the Uda loop methodology of trying to solve this problem. As David said, there was a load of assumptions that had to be made along the way in answering this question.
Yes.
So depending on whether our assumption went one way or another, we'd have come up with different solutions and different answers to this.
Right. Thanks, Evan.
As David said, it's tricky.
Thank
I suppose
you.
that's the point, right?
That is the point. It's to get the old brain cells working on this fine Friday afternoon. Thanks, Evan. And then, so the Cynefin framework, who in the group used that one? Do a thumbs up for me so I can just get a bit of a visual steer. Did anyone use that one? Can't see any thumbs up. No? It's always interesting to see who's called to use which ones. So that one wasn't used this time, which means that presumably quite a few of you use PACE. So if you were in a group that used the PACE model, feel free to unmute yourself and tell me what you found useful about it, what it illuminated. Don't be shy.
Hi. I started the chat by saying I always tend to like to keep things simple, and I thought it gave us an ability to, given the time frame that we had, we were able to simply analyze the problem. It was clear from the outset, obviously, we were lacking in evidence and facts and all the rest of it. To make loads and loads of assumptions. Assuming how key it was, obviously, as has already been mentioned about cash flow, profit, all that kind of stuff, we didn't want to lose market share. We considered in the end that we would end up pivoting to the expensive supplier. We considered going in and seeing if it was the receivership involved that we could perhaps buy the stock that the supplier may have already had, just to keep going for a bit. We might get it at a discount as well at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. And also consider redesign, as has already been mentioned. So that was kind of where we got to, I think, guys, was it? Yeah.
Thanks, Chaz. I hear that a lot about people liking the simplicity of the framework. There's something quite sort of user-friendly about it, isn't there?
Yeah.
Sharon's got her hand up. Sharon, dive in.
Thank you. We also picked PACE. We originally thought we didn't have enough context to make assumptions, that we just didn't have the context of knowing why they collapsed, whose fault it was, all those sorts of things, and why, and the implications of it. But we thought we had alternatives sorted, but then we sort of queried that there were other alternatives to the three listed, and that was obviously find a different supplier that wasn't an emergency, renegotiate with the emergency supplier, because we don't actually know if they're actually any good, because presumably, hopefully, we're not using them too often. Otherwise, that's a problem. But we recognised equally the acquisition of customer, replacement of customer if we lost them, if we paused, or if we stopped and redesigned, was just too expensive and not worth the risk. It's cost a lot more money to reapply and recruit customers and retain them. It's a lot cheaper to retain them. So we wanted to do that. We basically took the view that ultimately the best thing right now was to engage with the emergency supplier, even though it's more expensive straight away, engage with alternative providers immediately as well, because they might be better, and look to test the quality and the supply and the reliability of the emergency supplier, whilst also negotiating a better contract rate with them, because they now have a wonderful opportunity to work with us on a long-term basis. So that was really, there was lots of other discussion around it and considerations, but ultimately that's what we decided to do. And obviously to also debrief, why did it go wrong? Due diligence might have been brilliant at the first place, but we can't be in this position. It shouldn't be happening. Why did it collapse unexpectedly? Because clearly it could have been expected if we were close enough to it.
Thanks, Sharon. It sounds like you had a really good discussion in your group. So thank you for that debrief. Chris, I can see you've got your hand up. We've got time for one or two more and then we'll move on. So Chris.
Okay, well, we chose the PACE model because it was unexpected collapse and we needed to move at pace. So that's why we chose PACE. And we had a really good discussion. And I'm now going to pass you on to Catherine, who was in our group, because she's got a real live example of why we chose PACE and what we discussed. Over to you, Catherine.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, my partner works for a construction company, and this actually happened to him probably on a Friday afternoon, because these things happen on a Friday afternoon. They'd already had 1,000 windows from a company. They needed another 2,000. They all needed to be the same, and the company who was making the windows collapsed. And so we had a very fraught weekend while they decided what they were going to do. And they did exactly the PACE model, all the alternatives, looking at what could go wrong, sort of what the consequences could be, how they were going to get around it. And actually, in the end, the solution was to buy the window company and have that as a problem at a later date, because they didn't really want a window company. But it was putting the PACE model into action in a very real scenario, but very similar to this.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. That's great to get a real live example of something that happened over a weekend. Gosh, that really brings it to life for us. Thank you. Right. Well, I would love to stay talking about these models for longer, but we need to move on because what we're going to look at next is about cognitive bias and judgment, which is very, very important it's an important thing to be aware of when we're making decisions. Has anyone, when I say the term cognitive bias, I just wonder what that means to you. Has anyone got a nice definition that comes to mind for them, or what comes up for you when I say cognitive bias? Feel free to unmute if anyone knows what it is.
Well,
sorry, I'm German, so I have always a tendency to believe that the Germans are technically slightly better, although that's not really founded in any facts, because all the Formula One cars are built in the southern part of the UK. But somewhere in my head, I have this cognitive bias that if I see a German car, it probably is more reliable. I don't know. Sorry, I jumped in. I didn't raise my hand.
That's okay. That's okay. Anyone else? Anyone else got something that it means to them?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, again, that was a positive cognitive bias, Robert, there, I think. But cognitive bias really is just a predisposition in my mind to have a certain way of thinking about something based on your own experience and reality and an internal map of the world, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a systematic pattern of thinking that sometimes causes people to deviate from rational judgment or objective reality when they're making decisions or interpreting information. And there's different types of cognitive bias, and we're going to go through each of these in turn. The first one is confirmation bias. So this happens so frequently. It's where we have a tendency, or many people have a tendency, to search for interpret and remember information that backs up something you already believe. And actually, when we're presented with contradictory evidence, being able to kind of push it to one side, because we've already kind of decided the decision that we really want to make. So that's known as confirmation bias. It's something we need to be really careful of. Anchoring is when we rely too heavily on the first piece of information that we receive. That's known as the anchor. So when, even if it's a bit irrelevant or misleading, it's the kind of first thing we've hooked onto. Availability bias is judging the likelihood or importance really based on how easily kind of examples come to mind, rather than actual data or probability. Overconfidence, gosh, this is an important thing to be aware of. It's building self-awareness around this as a leader is so important. It's when people overestimate their own knowledge and ability, or ability to be accurate or predict outcomes. So we're actually overconfident in our ability. And then finally, groupthink. That's something that crops up time and time again in organisations and teams. It's where, as human beings, we're all wired actually to want harmony very often. And so it's where teams value harmony and consensus over critical thinking. It can lead people to agree with what's being said or suppress doubts, because the desire to get along is quite prevalent, and that can lead to some really bad decision making. So as I sort of share those with you, hopefully you can, it's going to be ringing some bells with you. You can spot it. Is there any one particular one of these that people see really frequently or have experienced?
So in my field, all of those, confirmation bias, anchor it, the whole lot. I'm in the fire service, so decision making and information gathering is massive, and you can get quite caught up in decision making traps. So you have to put in decision control procedures to alleviate those. So you don't expect with the confirmation bias that you see a fire in a building and it's a similar one to what you've been to before, and you want to expect that same outcome will take place. And you anchor on the same information that you have, so it's recognised prior learning. You don't want to be, too much involved in that one. And again, overconfidence in your own abilities, you may want to renege on asking specialist information from specialist people in order to resolve that incident. So, yeah, a lot of those resonate with me with regards to the biases.
Thank you. Yeah, most of us, when we hear these, it will ring true. We'll know that maybe we have a slight tendency towards doing them a couple of them ourselves. Often we'll really think about workplaces we've been in where we've noticed that some of these things happen. Anyone else? Is there any one particular one that really kind of resonates with you for any reason?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. Who's speaking? I'm just finding you online.
It's Paul Cawthorne here. Hello.
Hi, Paul.
Yeah. I've come across one where sometimes something that isn't actually true or tested, people spread it around as a false rumor, and everybody says, well, everyone's saying that, so it must be happening, or it must be true. And that makes me think, let's check it out.
Well, it sounds like you're very wise to do that. But yes, I've experienced that too.
Before I came into marketing, I was an insurance claims director, and then in the field as an investigator, where I often had to liaise with the police, and walking out of meetings backwards with your legs shaking the first time you do it, because you wonder if you're going to be alive when you get a tool hire company that's stealing from themselves and you're looking for the evidence to prove it. So anyway, let's go back to what you were saying.
Yes, thank you, Paul. So it's what I'm really hearing is that people are recognizing these in the workplaces they've been in, which I do too. And the reason why this stuff is important, why it's really important to think about cognitive bias, is that actually high pressure environments which many of us are working in these days, and certainly often leaders are, working under a lot of pressure. Those environments really amplify bias, and bias really reduces clarity, and it massively reduces the quality of the decisions that we make. So building in some self-awareness around this stuff is really important, but it's important to start to identify patterns that are happening in ourselves and in our colleagues, and start to build in checks so that we can make sure that our decisions are rigorous. I mean, essentially, what we're really talking about here is the brain using shortcuts.
Yes.
Those sorts of shortcuts have been helpful for survival, but they're pretty harmful for strategy. I heard someone say yes there, so I don't know who it was that said it, but it's
Paul. Yeah, Paul.
Oh, hi, Paul. So you recognise that?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. But I think we all get a bit worried sometimes because we feel we're standing out alone, and we're trying to convince everybody else to get back on track.
Yeah. Well,
Joanna,
yes.
sorry, my apologies. So mine's a physical cognitive bias. So unfortunately, I had a stroke and developed aphasia, and my language became very messy, and still does have moments of messiness.
Mm-hmm.
What I had to do was rethink, reconnect, re-speak to people, and it took some time, and it maybe still isn't completely cleared of the bias that I, and I'm sure disabled people have.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's an important point, because people in organisations are dealing with bias of all different kinds. I guess one of the things I was going to say about just the kind of basic psychology of some of this is that often our brains will everyone will have some sort of bias, and we'll be using shortcuts which have been helpful for survival. But actually, to make good decisions, we need what's known as bias friction, which actually slows fast thinking. So it allows us, when we are making decisions, to be really clear on actually, have we checked our bias? Have we really thought about how we might be on automatic pilot? Simon, I can see that you've got your hand raised. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say about what I've come across over the years, especially having spent the last 18 years as a contractor, only fairly recently moving back into the world of permanent. Is in the hiring process is confirmation bias. There's so seldom do you see, but it's this and somebody I was speaking to a couple of weeks back used this wonderful term. There's so much faffing around going on in the hiring process. And this term of seeking what he dubbed the unicorn candidate. There isn't that the people in all organisations don't consider things like transferable skills. And and a lot of focus on technical competence rather than technical and product can be taught, for example. And if this person's got the right aptitude and the attitude, and they can apply themselves, and they could be an asset to the organisation. It's that again confirming against a checklist of criteria and not being flexible at all.
Yeah, I'm a former headhunter in a previous life. I did that for about 20 years, and I do recognise what you're saying, and I think and the kind of flip side to that is also when people say things like, "Oh, the fit's got to be right, and I think this person would be a really great fit," and that's all. It's kind of coming at it from a different angle, because there you have to say, well, what makes this person a great fit? And what I used to find very often was actually it was because the person they were interviewing was very similar to them, came from a similar background, had a similar career trajectory. So there's also something about challenging that as well. But I do hear your point about the transferable skills. Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah, or transferring, or transferring commercial sector.
Yeah.
That kind of yes, yeah.
Yeah, but these things crop up all the time in recruitment processes. Which is why it's so helpful to make sure that it's a few elements are built in to reduce bias. So who else has got their hand up? So Teresa, I think you have your hand up too. Do you want to unmute yourself if you've got?
Sorry, I thought I had unmuted myself. Sorry. So a lot of this is linked to discussions about diversity. So if you've got a group of people who are diverse and different and varied, you tend to get, very different ways of thinking about things and very different processes of thinking that can counteract a lot of these biases that may be found in one of the individuals.
Yeah, it's a great point, and it's why diverse teams are higher-performing teams. Absolutely, to getting as many different perspectives in the room, and diversity on all levels is absolutely vital. So thank you for bringing that up. Andy, you've got your hand up. Did you want to say something too?
Just a feeling that for me, the whole point, when you're in a situation where there may be bias, not just from yourself, but from others, it surely is the challenging of or justifying the decisions. Because if you turn it around and say, well, why do you say that? Then you start to, somebody's trying to explain it themselves, they're automatically then being challenged. And then if there is a bias, then it may come to light that they haven't really, particularly the anchoring, the availability, that kind of instant decision making. Have they really considered it? Have they really been challenged through the thought process? So I think that doing it for yourself, right? Can you justify your decision? Is probably the simplest way to really check yourself to see if you have a bias in it.
Yeah, thank you, Andy. So we've got time for one more comment before we move on. David, I can see you've got your hand up.
Okay, thanks, everyone. It's been a really great conversation. Just one question from me. Is the phrase "learn to think the unthinkable" from Scenarios World? I wonder how successful, marks out of 10, do we perceive people as being able to be open to think the unthinkable, as opposed to I'm the expert here, I'm the experienced person here, and just not listening?
It's a great question.
To other perspectives, shall we say? Because what I find is most people don't believe. It comes down to belief. Some people just don't believe certain things are possible, and some other people believe that the future will be a repeat of the past, for instance.
Yeah, it's a really great point. I think it's a good thing to go away and reflect on. Actually, we don't have time to sort of have a discussion about it now, but it's a good challenge. I've just jotted that down. Learn to think the unthinkable on my notepad, which means that I'll be reflecting on it too. So let's just quickly summarize before we move into the next breakout room. So I think I've covered all of this here. Yep, high pressure environments amplify bias. I think we've covered all of that. So we're going to do another breakout room exercise now. And in your breakout room, you will, in pairs, you'll choose one real work decision and answers. Each pair will just choose one real work decision that you need to make and answer the following questions. Which bias most likely influenced that decision? How would you re-examine the decision with a bias check? And what early warning signs exist next time? So let me just, I think I've got that ready in. Okay, I'll just pop that in the chat for you. So Nicole, let's see, how are we doing time-wise? If we could have 10 minutes in the breakout rooms, please. So just give us a moment while Nicole kindly sorts that out. We'll send you away, and then we're going to come back to debrief. Is that clear for everyone? Yeah, good stuff. Just bear with us for a moment.
Yeah, I had to take it. That's why I disappeared. I hadn't decided to go do something else. I was trying to get
crack
back
on
in.
with a few tasks. Oh well, you know, you're well rested, but I'm sorry to hear that happened. Technical faults, unfortunately, do happen to all of us sometimes.
They do indeed. Yes.
Right, so I think everyone's back in the room now. So I hope you enjoyed that exercise. To kick us off, can I ask you just to pop into the chat which bias in the groups you were in, whatever it was you discussed, which bias you decided most influenced the decision that you were talking about, just so I can just get a bit of a sense of which ones were particularly discussed. Just confirmation bias, overconfidence, confirmation bias, oh, lots of confirmation bias. Anyone else? Oh, overconfidence again. Great. Yeah, overconfidence and confirmation bias seem to be coming through particularly strongly in what I've seen here so far. Yeah, brilliant. Anyone else? No, I think that's it. Okay, cool. Well, let's come back together and just explore it a little bit more then. Just interested to hear from anyone that would like to share, I guess, where in your discussions where you were finding that pressure created blind spots. Anyone got anything they'd like to debrief with the group?
On there. Probably can hear me now. Hello?
Yeah, we can. Yeah, I can hear you.
I joined quite late, so I have to excuse you for joining the room meeting with my colleagues from Ireland.
It's great to have you here.
Again, I'm sorry for being late.
These things happen, don't worry. So you managed to get into a breakout room?
Yes, and then I failed to communicate with my colleagues, unfortunately. They were talking about confirmation bias, and we were discussing the real case. And well, I couldn't give the example on my side, unfortunately, because I couldn't communicate, couldn't connect.
No problem. Well, would anyone who was in a group where something came up and they would like to share, like to just chip in at this point? So really interested in where in this scenario you were discussing, where pressure created blind spots and what safeguards you felt would help. Would anyone like to give us a sense of what you talked about?
I'll go if you like, Jo.
Thank you. Yes, please do. Who's speaking? I'm just scrolling down to find you.
It's Teresa.
Oh, hi, Teresa. Great. Go for it.
We both had examples of working with other people who have made overconfident decisions around hiring. You know, overconfidence and confirmation bias, where they've hired people that they've worked with in the past, or they've known, or in some cases been friends or family, and brought them into the business because they think it's a safe bet, because they think they know them, they think they've been able to perform in other arenas, and obviously bring them into a new environment. In most cases, it doesn't work out. And I can't say whether the pressure has caused any of that, or whether it's just a case of it's easier to make a quick decision, and I know this person and they'll fit in. They're a great guy. They'll do the job, and it's not worked out well.
Yeah, I have definitely seen that happen in a few places myself. So with that example, what safeguards do you think would actually help avoid that happening?
Well, it's quite difficult because obviously it depends on the organization, and both our organizations are very different sizes. If it's something like a big PLC, you would hope there was some sort of HR processes and SOPs you have to go through to hire people, but sometimes somebody's right at the top of the tree, they don't feel they have to follow those things, do they? And certainly my example was in an SME with a majority shareholder. So even though, you know, you can complain and put your viewpoint forward, it's not always going to be taken on board because you don't hold the vote.
That's a great example. Thank you. Thanks, Teresa. Chris, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I was working with Teresa on this. So, and as she said, we did have a similar thing, and it was about hiring. And I think the difficulty that we both found was on the structural safeguards to help. If they were at the top and they were making the decisions, there's not an awful lot you can do, really. A lot of people around us were saying, you know, it's going to fail, and we think it's going to fail, and it ultimately did fail. But the only thing that you could probably do is try and have a conversation around a group think and try and get more people involved to put pressure on one individual. Like Teresa said, he was a major shareholder, so ultimately, end of the day, he was going to make that decision. That would probably be very difficult because he's very confident in what he's trying to achieve. But if you had the group think back, then we may be able to put a bit of pressure on him to make him rethink it. But yeah, I don't think there would be anything else that we could do from a safeguarding point of view. Yeah.
It sounds like building in some procedures and processes to at least make sure different people feed into the decision and are alerting to potential issues is a good starting point for sure. Thank you for that, Chris. And Andy, what came up in your group?
Just when Chris was talking there and Teresa, the situation I had was similar. Was an owner, single owner, and at the corporate level, we created this facility where if there was a disagreement between himself and myself, we would go in a separate room and discuss it, quite animated in some occasions. And then obviously it was his decision as the owner at the end. But at least he had the wherewithal to think about something and maybe modify his decision. And then we would go back into the room and with the decision. So we basically created this sort of space to be able to have a more intense discussion outside the main group to give us that kind of opportunity rather than trying to do it as a group, which would have made other people uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that. That's a great example. Thank you. Anyone else like to feedback before we move on to the next section?
Yes, I would. Can you hear me?
Yes, Paul. Yes.
I think the way forward in that last discussion is to keep going, charm your way through, never be aggressive, but it's like having a velvet fist in a glove. You charm the money, charm the person that's got the ownership to make the decisions. Just keep going, and using examples, which is what I did earlier today. I had a problem with all the white lines had disappeared outside my daughter's house, and I wanted them to be repainted by the council. And they kept saying, "Oh, we never see that. We never go there. We don't know anything what you're talking about." I said, "Well, you've got photographs of all of the places and all of the names of the roads, but don't worry. I've got paint and I've got a brush. I can deal with it myself." You see? So what I was doing was taking it away from them. And the minute I did that, and I was charming about it, I wasn't aggressive, they came and did it the next day. And I think that's the way forward, always, is to charm your way through.
Well, I'm going to use that as my inspiration because I find I get really irritated on calls to do with getting things sorted or when people aren't doing what they need to do. So I think I'm going to channel my inner Paul next time I have one of those sorts of things to sort out.
Yeah, you have to make sure that you really appreciate their experience, their qualifications, you like them and everything else like that. You appreciate their difficulties. Yes, it is a long way to come here. Yes, I know you've got a massive workload. Let me help you. We need to do this. We don't want children killed, do we? Hit them with something gently. And then they'll worry so much they'll deal with it. If you give them the worst consequences, the dangers. The competition is creeping up behind us here. Are we going to let that happen? We don't want that to let that happen, do we? Come on, let's take the action now. We can do this. We're a team. We're happy together, aren't we? All of us. We're all on the same side. There's a lot of love in the room, isn't there? Bullshit.
So we're gonna move on to look at leading through ambiguity, which we talked earlier on about how complex the world that leaders are operating in can be, and I think the challenge with many leadership decisions is that they don't necessarily always have a right answer. Sometimes they do, but sometimes there's just better or worse outcomes. And so it's really about operating in the face of that uncertainty and getting as clear as you possibly can. So that means that leaders need to balance things like data, intuition, insight, and organisational priorities when they're trying to lead through this kind of complexity and ambiguity. So there's a few different ways that we can do that. It's things like scenario testing, which is testing against possible future scenarios, things that could happen. If I could just ask, if you're not speaking, could you put yourselves on mute, just because there's a few of us in the room and a bit of background noise. So yes, running pre-mortems. So this is where we actually imagine the things that could go wrong before we commit. Really thinking about and how we would categorise and rate our confidence levels so that we're honest about how much we actually know versus what we're assuming. And it's really, really important when leading through ambiguity to think about reversible versus irreversible decisions. So of course, when a decision is reversible, this is where we can maybe be a bit more experimental. We can maybe, because we know we can iterate, and we can make faster decisions. But where something is really irreversible, this is where the wrong decision or decisions may come at a cost. So we've got to be building enough safeguards and consideration time to make the most of these. So together, these techniques shift us away, the goal away from being right to being really thoughtful and adaptive, and really clear about why we're choosing the path that we are. And so part of being a decision maker is actually being accountable for decisions. And accountability doesn't just mean responsibility after a decision's been made. Actually, accountability shapes the quality of the decision itself. And in high pressure environments, unclear ownership and hidden assumptions can be the biggest reason why decisions fail. Something, that we see quite a bit. And so this slide here, these 4 bullet points highlight the essentials that prevent that kind of drift and confusion once a decision's made. So the first one is clear rationale. And what we find time and time again is that teams are far more likely to support and actually execute and deliver on decisions that they understand, even if they don't actually agree with it, or they don't fully agree. So having that understanding and being able to present your clear rationale is really key. It reduces resistance and it also promotes better governance. So the kinds of questions that you might ask are things like, what prompted this decision? How does this decision connect to strategic priorities? How can I explain it? And would somebody who wasn't in the room when the decision was made, how easy would they find it to actually explain why we chose this path? So when you're in this situation, what we would encourage is being able to when you're making a decision, being able to developing, I suppose, the discipline of always coming up with a rationale that can be explained in 1 or 2 sentences, because getting that clarity reduces second guessing later on. The second bullet point here is transparency of assumptions. So absolutely every decision that's made can sit on top of a whole load of assumptions beneath the surface about things like people, about timelines, risk, you name it. People, as human beings, we love to make assumptions. And most decision failures actually we can trace them back to inaccurate assumptions or unspoken assumptions that people are making, rather than necessarily the decision itself. So the kinds of questions you might ask yourself, it might be something like, what assumptions must be true for this decision that you're making to work, for example. As I say that, I'm just going to put it out to the group. I wonder which sorts of assumptions you think might be particularly high risk when making decisions. Any examples, anyone that spring to mind for anyone? Anything spring to mind?
Thinking when choosing people who can provide services to you, the risk is that you assume because they offer that service, they're going to be capable and be able to actually provide what they say they do. But different levels of quality across all potential suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely. Assumptions about quality. Absolutely, I hear you. Thank you. Thanks, Michael. And Robert, you've got your hand up.
One thing I always struggle with is the sustainability of a solution. Because where I work, we move jobs every 3 to 5 years without getting fired, but we move around. And if you then do a transition, or if you outsource something, and then they might have an even higher turnover, you might lose critical knowledge after 2 to 4 years, after just 2 or 3 rotations. So I think making sure, as was just mentioned, have the right people and know they can deliver. But yeah, can they deliver also in the 2nd or 3rd generation? Is your system robust enough for that?
Yeah, thank you. And where do you think people tend to be over optimistic when they're making assumptions?
Well, because everybody moves 3 to 5 years, you often only have to make the decision and then see the first 6 months of the implementation. And then you might go on, so you don't have to actually live with the consequences. So I like this idea that they have in IT, you need to eat your own dog food. You implement it, but you need to use it. You cannot just implement it for somebody else to use it. But that's, of course, not always possible. So I think the people who make the decisions are sometimes a bit too far removed from the actual hurt you have afterwards.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. I mean, one thing...
High enough in the organization, because I still have the...
One thing that can be really helpful to do when making decisions is to capture assumptions in writing. And this can become... So just think about the assumptions that are being made as part of the decision-making process. And that can become a tool in itself, actually, for monitoring and kind of course correcting as you go if it's actually recorded. And yes, the next bullet point is all about ownership, which is, gosh, so critical. Who owns the decision and who executes it? And these things are often confused, I think, in organisations. They're actually not the same thing, are they? Ownership and execution ownership. Sorry, decision ownership and decision... I can't speak. It's that time on a Friday afternoon. Decision ownership and execution ownership can get quite confused, I think. And the thing is, if it's everyone's decision, it's actually no one's decision, because it kills accountability when that happens. So who is the decision owner often in organisations? Who do you think that should be? What's their accountability, I suppose?
I'd say that it's typically, again, Joe, I'd say it's simply the person who owns the activity, the process, or the or the project. So the person that's, again, is up, and you've already used the term that accountability. So when you think, of course, it makes me rumbling around in the world of change and transformation. We do keep a very tight rein on things, and we're using the well-established tools, things like RACI Matrix. So not going to bother with the C and the I today, but to your point about who executes it, that's the person who's responsible. But the person who is accountable, who has the ultimate ownership of of a particular particular activity or deliverable. Yeah, and as much as you say about tracking your assumptions, we always run a decision log as well. So and in that decision log we do assign ownership and accountability and responsibility, so that we can come back to it if things are going awry, and we perhaps need to go back to that senior stakeholder and get and change things around.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you brought up RACI, because I was going to mention that in a moment. So for anyone that's not familiar with it, it stands for responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And actually, you don't necessarily need to build out a full matrix, but you can really. This is a really helpful thing to think about in terms of decisions, because there should be one decision owner, so one person that the buck stops with, but then multiple, the people who are responsible for actually executing on the decision. It might be one person, it might be lots of different people. And then thinking about who needs to be consulted in advance of the decision being made for it to be a good decision, very helpful exercise to do. And then who needs to be kept informed, normally after this decision, just to make sure that there's no kind of roadblocks in the way. It's a tool that actually can be really helpful, or at least elements of it can be for this too. So thank you for bringing that up. I can see a couple of hands up. Andy.
Yeah, I've just been working with a company who've been going through a bit of a transition, and they did create along their main process, they did have a RACI on everything. But before that, the conversation, there has been occasions where a leader has to make a decision and give the responsibility or accountability to another person or another group. So I think that when you're remembering the accountability of the decision, that decision could be a completely different person or different group to the ones actually taking responsibility. Because unless people understand their own accountability and they step up to accept it, sometimes you have to just say, right, you guys have to get on with this. And then there's you're making the decision, or that leader's making the decision. So you can't have a clear separation. Okay, this person made a decision, but these are the people who have to actually execute it.
Yeah, absolutely. And Robert?
Yeah, I find these RACI matrices also helpful, but sometimes can be a bit convoluted. The shortcut sometimes for me is on whose scorecard will it show when this doesn't work. And even more importantly for us, because I work in a very safety conscious environment, who has to report and record in their scorecard the HSSE incident. That normally sharpens the mind, and suddenly people who thought they were not accountable suddenly realize, yeah, that's actually, I'm accountable. I'm the one who has to explain this to the higher help, why this has gone wrong. It's not the person I've delegated the task to.
Yeah.
Because particularly in the beginning of these projects or the stuff that we decide, I find there's a lot of people who have opinions who all need to be heard. At the moment something goes wrong, you're a bit lonely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Robert. So when we're making decisions, what we need to think about is our personal decision habit loop. And I say this with no judgment, because everybody does this. So we just want to understand it so that we can actually intervene where our habits are not serving us. So we have to think about the trigger, the pattern, and the outcome, and where bias shows up and where clarity actually breaks down. So triggers are the conditions that push you into decision-making mode. Okay, now we're all triggered constantly, and these triggers might be external, so deadline, a crisis, a demand from above, stressful situation at work. It might be something internal, like feeling a sense of anxiety or urgency, kind of ways we might tend to show up sometimes. And this can tip us into I need to decide quickly mode. So we've got to start to observe our early signals. You know, what causes us stress and how does that stress show up in us? We then need to think about the pattern. So what do we typically do next when we're under stress or when we're triggered in some way? So these are automatic behaviours. They're things that historically might have served us really well, but might no longer be working or might not work well in every single situation. So, for example, some leaders might tend to overanalyze, but other people might decide too quickly. They might pride themselves on being really decisive and actually not analyse enough. Some people might be really consultative, but actually overly seek input, and other people might avoid it and just want to make their own decision. But we need to understand what we tend to do and what our default setting is, so that we can build in some pauses to slow that down a little bit and recognise what we're doing. And the thing is, patterns are adaptive. As I say, they emerge because they once worked. And often things that become patterns or weaknesses are actually strengths that are a bit overplayed. So as I say, you know, people who really pride themselves on being collaborative, consultative leaders, it can be a massive strength. But, you know, under pressure, maybe it could mean that that person is struggling to make a decision because they have to get buy-in from everybody, and actually they're not going to be able to make everyone happy, for example. So one thing I really invite you to do is to really think about your own pattern and how that's shaped. You know, is it shaped by your past success? Is it shaped by the culture of the organisation that you work in? Perhaps you have a kind of inbuilt level of risk tolerance that you're comfortable with, and anything that pushes that makes you feel uncomfortable. I mean, there can be all sorts of things, but it's, you know, worth having a real think about. And then we move to outcome, which is what tends to happen as a result. So mapping the outcome makes the loop really visible. So it's things like good choices, poor choices, delays, or like how confident you and your team feel. It can be a relational thing as well. So the key really is to notice patterns across the decisions that you're making rather than treating them as one-off events. And we've talked a lot about bias already, but the reason it's mentioned again on this slide is that bias tends to appear between the trigger and the pattern. So it's in the fast thinking space where you are going to make a quick decision or you're going to default to something. That's where the danger zone is with bias. It's where assumptions rush in that we might actually ignore, or shape rather what we notice and ignore. So before we move on to our final exercise, I'm just going to put one final question out there, which is which bias tends to influence your snap interpretation of a decision? Can you just type in the chat? Conscious bias, confirmation bias, a few different ones coming up here. Yeah, overconfidence, confirmation. Yeah, we can see lots of different ones following oversimplification, confirmation bias. Yeah, so we can see that we're all aware of it, and that awareness is great. Is you know, important. So where clarity breaks down, it's important to think about that too. So clarity often breaks down between the pattern and the outcome. It's where habits start to override intention. So you need to think about in your loop where the clarity starts to slip. And improving clarity often actually requires greater rationale, you know, ownership and communication. So all of these things are really important. But the key is once you understand your loop, you can interrupt it. I'm going to pause there. I'm mindful of time, and we actually have one final exercise to do. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms for 10 minutes. And I'm just going to talk you through what the final breakout room is, if I can just close this chat. Okay. So it's an ambiguity scenario and accountability map. A new competitor is about to launch a disruptive product. You have incomplete data about timing and price, and you must decide how aggressively to reposition your offer. And you're going to make a decision despite incomplete data and create an accountability map. And you're going to discuss the points below. I'm just going to pop this in the chat quickly. We're going to have 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back for a very speedy debrief and just move towards wrapping things up because we're coming towards the end of the session now. So Nicole is going to pop you into breakouts. Hi everyone, welcome back. So I'd love to know in the chat what your key takeaway from that exercise was. We don't have enough time for a really detailed debrief, but just let me know what you took from that.
Stephen, speak.
I think the key takeaways are, you know, in a massive organisation, you've got to know your company, you've got to know who's on the board and what people's strengths are and aren't, especially when it comes to group solve. And again, it's that testing the market, isn't it? I think through good communication up and down and throughout the company, if everybody knows their place within the food chain, then a product can be quite successful. Now, if people don't know what way they're pushing, then that becomes a bit of a quagmire, and then we're not successful. And I think that's when these fad products come in and test that market. It might be a one-hit wonder, which doesn't have any longevity, and then we spend all our time worrying about what ifs rather than what could do's. And I think that's what I've taken away from this exercise, really.
Thank you for sharing that. Has anyone else got anything they want to put in the chat? Just quick summary. If anyone else wants to, sadly, we don't have time to go around the room asking everybody, but just anything that comes up if you want to whack it in the chat. So Andy, it's a reaction decision, principally sales and marketing ownership, but consulting finance, productivity and operations. Consult with all on the board, seek views, ensure all noted. Thanks, Chris.
No problem.
Yeah, excellent. I can't quite believe it. It feels like the time's whizzed actually, but we're approaching the end. And what I would love to know and invite you to go away and think about in detail actually is what you're going to do with the information you've received today. So practically, how's it going to change how you operate? So the last thing I need to do is to say thank you. It's been fantastic working with you over the last couple of hours. Thank you for all of your contributions, your energy, your thoughts. It was all very welcome. So thank you for coming. We've come to the end. So you're free to go and enjoy your weekend.